So the interesting thing about all race cars is history. Whether the car did a lot of racing, whether the car won any major races, who drove the cars, how the cars finished, all part of the history of the cars. What made the factory team cars so unique for Carroll Shelby was the fact that they had a bunch of character driving these cars. You had Bondurant, you had Bob Johnson, you had Ken Miles, everybody's seen the movie. All of these guys were characters, and one of the guys that raced for Shelby was a fellow named Tom Payne. And he ended up with the nickname Gentleman Tom Payne. And the irony of that was it was just a fluke. He was late for a race, he only had a couple of minutes to get behind the wheel of the car. Somehow Shelby or the team convinced the track to allow him to do a couple of laps because he had never been there, he wasn't able to qualify, and he wasn't able to practice. So he jumped right into the car wearing his suit and tie and did 5 laps to get acquainted with the track. Corner workers were scrambling all over the place. They thought that somebody had actually stolen the car and was doing a joyride around the track. Soon they realized it was Tom Payne getting ready for the race. Again, because he was late, he had to start at the back of the field. He didn't have time to qualify in the car. He stayed in his suit and tie, put a helmet on, was ready to race. With 2 laps left to go, he ended up winning the race, and forever he was known as Gentleman Tom Payne, the fellow that raced in a suit and tie. He did that on quite a few occasions, and his reputation just grew. His reputation as a great race car driver grew as well. When Tom Payne caught Ford and Shelby's eye and he was doing a great job racing, Ford actually ended up paying for this car $24.30, and they said, build this car for Tom Payne to go race. Quite a few times he raced under the Shelby banner, making this a factory team car. He also raced it individually before he became a full-time Shelby driver and ended up at Le Mans in the Daytona Coupes. So not only does this car have great history, but it's got spectacular paperwork, period photos, original invoices from AC Cars to Shelby, from Shelby to Ford, the option list, or at least the prices for the options. So picture this, in 1964, this car was $9,250, an absurd amount of money for a race car back in the day. But because it was a factory team car, it was worth spending the money. And there's a lot of differences to a regular car. We can start at the front of the car. So the competition cars, they needed the quick jacks. They actually had a bar like a Formula One car to lift up the front of the car so they could change the tires. Underneath there, you've got the scoops to cool the brakes. You've also got a lower scoop for the oil cooler. You've got a different radiator. As far as the wheels go, you've got a set of 6.5-inch Hellebrands on the front, 8.5-inch Hellebrands on the back, flares that were done by Shelby's. The early cars, the real early cars didn't have flares yet, but as they progressed, this car's fairly late, 2430, they had all the flares on it. They riveted the skin because there was problems with the skins coming apart, and that's why the rivets are on the front of the hood. Obviously, it's got a hood scoop to allow air into the Weber setup. As far as the exhaust goes, you've got headers and a side exhaust on the car. You had different windscreens depending where they were racing. So you had some with a cut down windscreen. This same car had a full windscreen. It depended on just what group it was racing with. You go to the interior, it had one racing bucket, had the chrome roll bar. Dash layout is very similar to a regular Cobra, other than this one had a sun tack from the factory, and it had a fuel pressure gauge in the clock location. The rest of the interior, pretty much stock. Now, when it comes to the gas tank, this one had the long-range fuel tank, had the Le Mans filler cap up here, and if you look in the trunk, you can see the secondary long-range fuel tank that sits back here. You have the electric fuel pumps, pumping the fuel to the front, and then, of course, you've got a set of Coney shocks, you got front and rear sway bar, but the real prize is under the hood. So under the hood, you have a 289 hypo engine, but with 12.5-to-1 compression, a big radical cam, big 48 Webers on top. Some cars had the flamethrower ignition. This one has a dual point ignition on it. They were really tweaked out. They were probably making somewhere around 385 horsepower. And in a light car, keep in mind these cars were weighing in race trim, they were somewhere around 2,000 pounds. These cars really worked. So not only is this car a factory team car, great driver with an interesting history, but the car also won between 64 and 66, won 11 races, finished on the podium multiple times, was a really historic car that did extremely well. We've got a bunch of documentation and a bunch of photographs in period when this car raced. And one of the interesting things that we had to get for this car was the finger on the back. We're not 100% certain. Obviously somebody had a sense of humor. Maybe he was just flipping the bird to the Corvettes that were way behind him. Maybe he was flipping the bird to the Grand Sports that were cheater cars trying to beat him. He did extremely well against the Corvettes, and I think it was something to say, hey guys, we're kicking your ass. So the best thing about a 289 Cobra, especially a team car or any competition car, is how it sounds. I mean, picture these cars back in the day, super lightweight. They were somewhere around 2,000 pounds. You know, 385 horsepower, maybe 400 horsepower. But the Webers, the side exhaust, you know, you can hear the electric pumps going. It's just a great car to drive, and it sounds just incredible. Picture that at 7,000 RPM back in the day. It would be just a pleasure to drive. So it's always interesting when it comes to what is the value of one of these cars, and it's so hard to tell. It comes down to, is it a factory competition car? Does it have team history? Who drove the car? What did it win? You know, did it have any bad stories to the car? All of those things, quality of the restoration, who did the restoration, you know, all of those things add up. So we've had a recent sale. We had a car that sold at Pebble Beach in 2021. That car brought a roughly 4.1 all in. So is this car worth the same as that? Maybe not. That car was driven by Ken Miles. Is Tom Payne as big a name as Ken Miles? No, but boy, the car's history is impeccable. The restoration was done by Bill Murray, spectacular job. The owners reads like the who's who of Cobra race cars that have owned it over the years. So I think this car is not worth the same as that, but it's certainly worth close to that. Somewhere in the mid threes is probably a reasonable number. And if you look at it from a historical point of view, approximately 25 competition roadsters that were team cars were built. A handful of those were destroyed, leaving a super rare amount of cars, very few with original bodies, original chassis that are in this sort of condition. Compared to a modern Enzo, this car is worth less money than an Enzo today, or the same money as an Enzo, the same money as a LaFerrari, the same money as a lot of other cars today that are modern sports cars that really don't have much race history involved to them. And then if you look at the production numbers, 20 compared to 300, 500, 800, these cars are still great value with great history, and I think as time goes on, they're going to look cheap in hindsight.